World War I was one of the most bloodiest events in human history. Roughly 10 million soldiers were killed during that time, yet the war claimed over 20 million lives and would leave another 21 million injured, including civilians. Throughout that time, Europe was still the centre of art and culture. By 1914, bold new art forms were challenging convention and breaking new ground. Art was no longer about aesthetic perfection or style or form. Modern art was a way of thinking, a process of thought. It didn't have to be pretty either. You didn't have to like it to appreciate it, as long as it made you feel something. During the war, Switzerland remained neutral, and its capital Zurich became home to many who fled the conflict, including public figures such as writer James Joyce, and where an ambitious young Lenin plotted his revolution. There also lived two German refugees, Emmy Hennings and Hugo Ball, both earning a living as entertainers and writers throughout the city, until in 1916 they set up their own cabaret in the Café Molière. Naming it after the French philosopher Alain Cabaret, the Cabaret Voltaire was a hub of creativity and free expression. The opening night had gathered interest from many like-minded artists, including Romanian poet Tristan Tzara, painter and architect Marcel Janco, Alsatian painter Hans Arp, and Sophie Tauber, a Swiss painter, designer and sculptor. Finally, they were joined by Richard Hulsenbeck, a writer and friend of Ball's from before the war. Together, this troupe of artists would create what would be known as Dada.
So across the nationalities, it's a kind of international movement. Really an evening before it's a movement, if you like. So you advertise them to come to this cabaret to make an evening's entertainment of artists who are really in Switzerland because they're opposed to the war. They're opposed to the culture of, I suppose, a nationalistic culture. I mean, Hugo Ball brings a particular anarchistic inflected libertarian and a destructive libertarian kind of characteristic. He studies Nietzsche and he studies Bakunin, the Russian anarchist Bakunin, and the association with nihilists, and he says, "I am dynamite," which is borrowing a line from Nietzsche. So he does his dissertation on Nietzsche. So it's this kind of perspective of informed by 19th century anarchistic and nihilistic political revolutionaries, which goes into the cultural revolution, which is Dada.
Dada was more of a force of nature than an art movement. The word Dada itself being meaningless, it embraced absurdity and obscurity. Dada was disruptive, it was illogical, nonsensical in the face of senselessness. It went against convention, against the establishment. Its aim was to destroy all preconceptions of what art should be.
Dada intended to be the records of civilization. This is what early futurism wanted to be with the Futurist Manifesto, to destroy the libraries, the museums and the academies of every kind. This kind of disruptive gesture, because you're surrounded by an institutionalized culture which doesn't speak to you in a visceral way. And remember, it's the preserve of the young, so it's this young kind of artist trying to find the language that they need to speak. They recognise a kind of living death surrounding them, either because they're living in the midst of, in the centre of Europe and surrounded by the First World War, or it's this kind of staid, ossified museum, dusty culture that doesn't have a vitality in a life that a beating drum or a beating heart has in Cabaret Voltaire.
The Dadists in Zurich believed in the deconstruction of language and revolt against corrupt voices. This saw the movement spread throughout the art world. Artists in Berlin had quickly adopted Dada to satirise the German government. Hannah Hoch would create the first ever photo montages to obscure the context of images, a technique that would later inspire generations of designers, animators and filmmakers.
Berlin Dada is a very different fish from Zurich Dada in 1916, because Berlin Dada is much more to do with photomontage and the political propaganda, critiquing the rise of fascism. It's much more aligned to, ideologically aligned to socialism. There's parallels to the approach of something like Kurt Schwitters and Merz, where it's an assemblage of fragments of debris which he makes, principally small collages, and then expands that to a room-sized environment. But that doesn't have the same level of political efficacy or targeted in the way that photomontage does. It's a similar kind of approach and method, but it's a very different visual language.
Even before the Cabaret Voltaire, artists were making waves in what would later be considered as Dadaist works. By 1912, French artist Marcel Duchamp was already creating what he described as anti-art.
Somebody who's associated with Dada is Marcel Duchamp, but he's not in Switzerland, he's in Paris and then in New York. And his Nude Descending a Staircase, presented at the Army show, and then he goes on to do the ready-mades, and the thing that's most associated with Dada in terms of fine art practice, painting and sculpture, if you like, is the ready-made, and that overturns the whole kind of category of the art object and what constitutes art and is it art. And that's 1917. So that's in New York, though. He's fled Europe because of the war.
Dada practitioners had made their mark as fine artists by breaking every single rule of art.
Dada doesn't criticise schools of art that come before it, like Cubism or Impressionism or Post-Impressionism, Futurism and Purism and so on. Dada criticises art as an institution, and this is what Dada does differently from any other kind of avant-garde, and it does so through, on the one hand, the ready-made, and on the other hand, different forms of manifestation of culture, like the Cabaret Voltaire. So like an event-based, kind of performative, ephemeral thing which is gone the next day, or a manifesto, which is a new cultural, it's a known cultural form from the field of politics, but in the field of art, to have a manifesto which is so antagonistic to art itself.
Dada had exploded all over the world, but in its true nature, Dada went against popularity. By its own definition, Dada would eventually eat itself.
So this is what I mean about it being a kind of a way of life, or a tendency, or an attitude, rather than a set of forms, So obviously, so it kind of mutates. Probably the best way to describe it is it's like a mutating virus, So that, and you could also then the flip side of that is to say that maybe the culture inoculates itself after a while, because it collects it and buys it, puts it in a museum. So if you go and see Duchamp's fountain, the urinal upturned, it's in a vitrine, it's under glass. So it's kind of inoculated, immunised, the institution's immunised against its potential to do harm.
Did Dada fade away into obscurity? It couldn't. Dada was a way of thinking, an entire philosophy. The movement may have ended, but its philosophy would outlive all other art movements.